She said I was the first man who ever made her feel safe. I believed her. I believed every word, every tear, every promise. I thought she left the bar life for me, that I was her fresh start. And then I opened my phone and saw her on stage again, smiling, dancing, just like the night we met. I'm holding Jessamine's hand right now as I tell you this story. Well, not really. That was 8 months ago, on a beach in Siargao, the white sand warm between my toes, the coconut juice cold in my other hand, and her fingers feeling like salvation wrapped around mine. The sunset painted everything golden, including her face when she looked at me with those dark eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. "No more bars, Angus," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the waves. "I promise. You saved me from that life. I want to be clean for you, good for you." I wanted to believe those words so desperately that I ignored every instinct screaming in my head. When a 74-year-old Scottish widower finds a 29-year-old Filipina telling him he's her hero, logic doesn't just take a holiday, it packs its bags and moves to another country entirely. "You really mean that, lass?" I asked, my voice cracking like a teenager asking his first date to prom. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks, and said, "I've never felt this safe with anyone. You make me want to be better." That night, lying in our bamboo hut listening to the ocean, I cried myself to sleep. Happy tears, mind you, the kind I hadn't shed in over a decade. For the first time since Margaret died, I felt like I mattered to someone again, like my life had purpose beyond counting pension payments and watching the Scottish rain. The man I used to be would have spotted this performance from a mile away. That man was sharp, practical, built successful businesses, and raised 3 sons who respected him. But that man died slowly alongside my wife Margaret in Aberdeen General Hospital. Cancer took her piece over 18 months, and I watched helplessly as the woman who'd shared my bed for 47 years disappeared into a collection of tubes and machines. "Promise me you'll live, Angus," she whispered during her final week. "Don't just exist, live." I promised her everything she asked for, including that lie. After the funeral, my sons David, Robert, and James tried their best to keep me connected to the world. Sunday dinners became awkward affairs, where they'd update me on grandchildren I barely knew and careers I couldn't follow. "Dad, you need to get out more," David would say. "Maybe join a club or take a class." But grief, I discovered, is a jealous companion. It wants you all to itself, wrapped in memories and regret. I pushed my boys away systematically, declining invitations, cutting conversations short, until their calls became duty check-ins and their visits felt like charity work. Retirement was supposed to be our golden time, Margaret's and mine. Instead, it became an endless series of empty days in an empty house where every corner held echoes of what I'd lost. That's when YouTube became my escape, hours of mindless scrolling through videos about anything that wasn't my life. Travel channels, cooking shows, documentaries about places I'd never visit and people I'd never meet. Then the algorithm, that digital fortune teller, started feeding me videos about retiring abroad. "Live like a king in Southeast Asia," they promised. "Your pension goes further in paradise." American and Australian men my age, grinning beside young Asian women, showing off apartments and lifestyles that seemed impossible on fixed incomes. "I was lonely and broke in Sydney," one gray-haired Australian explained to the camera. "Now I live like a millionaire in Manila." The women beside them were always smiling, always attentive, always grateful. It looked like hope packaged in tropical sunsets and affordable living costs. I watched these videos obsessively, taking notes like a student cramming for finals. 3 months later, I liquidated everything Margaret and I had built together and booked a one-way ticket to Manila with nothing but a suitcase and the kind of desperate optimism that only comes from having nothing left to lose. The Philippines hit me like a wall of heat, noise, and possibilities the moment I stepped off the plane at Ninoy Aquino Airport. Everything was different. The smell of tropical air mixed with exhaust fumes, the chaos of jeepneys and tricycles weaving through traffic that followed no rules I could understand, the the sound of Tagalog and broken English creating a linguistic symphony I was eager to join. I spent my first week in Manila like a tourist in my own life, wandering malls and eating at Jollibee, trying to understand how this country worked. The expat community found me before I found them. Lonely foreign men gathering in air-conditioned coffee shops to complain about the heat and compare their Philippine adventures. "You need to get out of Manila," advised Pete, a retired American whose gut hung over his belt like a declaration of surrender. "The real Philippines is in the provinces. Davao City is perfect for guys like us. Safe, affordable, and the women there are traditional, family-oriented, not like these Manila gold diggers." He winked when he said it, and I pretended to understand what he meant. 2 weeks later, I was on a Cebu Pacific flight to Davao, watching the archipelago spread out below me like scattered emeralds in an azure sea. Davao City felt manageable in a way Manila never had. The pace was slower, the people friendlier, the cost of living even more ridiculously affordable. I rented a 3-bedroom house in Tagum for 12,000 pesos a month, about what I'd pay for a decent meal back in Aberdeen. The landlord, a chatty man named Tony who spoke excellent English, helped me buy furniture and explained the basics of Philippine life. "You need a girlfriend, sir," he said matter-of-factly, while we shopped for a refrigerator. "Foreign men who live alone here get sad very quickly. The culture is different. Family is everything. Community is everything. Isolation will kill you faster than the heat." I laughed it off at the time, but his words stuck with me during those first lonely weeks when the novelty of cheap beer and tropical fruit couldn't fill the silence in my oversized house. That's how I ended up at Blue Moon, a small bar tucked between a sari-sari store and a motorcycle repair shop in downtown Davao. It wasn't one of those flashy tourist traps with neon signs and aggressive barkers. Just a humble place with a small stage, a handful of tables, and working girls who danced for lonely men pretending they were there for the music. The other customers were mostly foreigners like me, German pensioners and Australian retirees nursing San Miguel beers and watching the show with expressions ranging from boredom to desperate hunger. I ordered a beer and tried to blend into the shadows, telling myself I was just observing local culture, not participating in whatever this was. Then I saw Jessamine, and every lie I'd been telling myself evaporated like morning mist. She was different from the other dancers, moving like she was underwater, her eyes focused on something far beyond the smoky room. While the other girls smiled with practiced enthusiasm, flirting with customers between songs, Jessamine looked genuinely sad. Beautiful, certainly, with the kind of exotic features that made foreign men write bad poetry, but sad in a way that seemed to echo my own emptiness. She wore a simple red dress that had seen better days, and when she danced, it was with the mechanical precision of someone going through motions rather than expressing joy. During her break, she sat alone at the bar, staring into a glass of water like it held answers to questions she couldn't voice. "Are you all right, lass?" I found myself asking, the words escaping before I could stop them. She looked at me like I'd just spoken in ancient Sanskrit, her dark eyes wide with something between surprise and suspicion. The other customers didn't talk to the girls during breaks, apparently. They waited for the performance to resume. "You asked if I was okay," she said slowly, her English careful and deliberate. "Men don't usually ask that here." Then, without warning, she started crying. Not the manipulative tears I'd learned to recognize later, but real, ugly sobs that shook her small frame and made the other girls look over with concern. "I'm sorry," she whispered, wiping her eyes with a cocktail napkin. "I shouldn't cry in front of customers. It's unprofessional." "What's wrong, love?" I asked, sliding onto the bar stool beside her, ignoring the curious stares from the other patrons. She looked around nervously, as if checking for permission to have this conversation. "My daughter," she said finally. "She needs new school uniforms, books for next semester. The tuition is due next week, and I'm short 3,000 pesos. I hate this place, but I have no choice. My family depends on me." Her honesty hit me like a physical blow. Here was a young woman, roughly the same age as my youngest son, reduced to dancing for strangers to pay for her child's education. "What's your daughter's name?" I asked. "Mia," she said, her face lighting up for the first time that evening. "She's 7, smart like her mama, but she wants to be a teacher when she grows up. She doesn't know about this place. I tell her I work at a restaurant." Without thinking, I pulled 5,000 pesos from my wallet and placed it on the bar between us. "For Mia's school," I said. "No strings attached." Jessamine stared at the money like it might disappear if she blinked. "Why?" she whispered. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." I shrugged, feeling more useful than I had in months. Because every child deserves an education, and every mother deserves respect. That first night changed everything. I didn't stay for the rest of the show, didn't expect anything in return for the money. I just left Jessamine sitting at the bar, staring at those bills like they represented hope itself. But I came back the next night, and the night after that, not for the dancing but to see if she was okay, to buy her a meal during her break, to listen to her talk about Mia's progress in school and her dreams of someday leaving Davao for Manila where opportunities were better. She was intelligent, I discovered, far more educated than her circumstances suggested. She'd finished 2 years of college before her boyfriend abandoned her with a baby and a pile of debt. "I was going to be a nurse," she told me one evening, absently stirring her coffee. I was good at it too. But when Mia came, everything changed. Dreams don't pay for diapers and medicine. Her English improved dramatically over those weeks, and I realized she'd been dumbing herself down for the other customers, playing the role they expected rather than showing who she really was. 3 months into our strange friendship, Jessamine made an announcement that stopped my heart. "I want to quit this place," she said during one of our late-night conversations in a 24-hour McDonald's near the bar. "I've saved enough money, thanks to your help, to take a break. Maybe find something better, something clean." She reached across the table and took my weathered hand in her smooth young one. "Would you help me? Not with money. I mean with finding work. You know people, right? Expats who might need a housekeeper or assistant." The hope in her voice was intoxicating. Here was my chance to be someone's hero, to rescue a damsel in distress like the knights in the stories my mother used to read me. "You could stay with me," I heard myself saying, "until you get on your feet. I have plenty of space and it would be safer than some boarding house." She cried then, the good kind of tears, and said, "You would do that for me? For us? Mia too?" I nodded, feeling like I was 20 years old again instead of 74. 2 weeks later, Jessamine quit Blue Moon and moved into my house in Tagum with nothing but a pink suitcase, a box of her daughter's clothes, and a smile that could have powered the entire province. "I can't believe this is real," she said, spinning around my living room like a child in a toy store. "We have our own rooms, our own space, real beds with clean sheets." Mia was shy at first, hiding behind her mother's legs and studying me with the careful eyes of a child who'd learned that adults weren't always trustworthy. But she warmed up quickly when I showed her my tablet loaded with educational games and cartoons. "Can I really use this whenever I want?" she asked in careful English. "It's yours?" I said, and the smile that spread across her face made every peso I'd spent worth it. Those first few months were the happiest I'd been since Margaret's diagnosis. My house filled with life in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Jessamine cooked breakfast every morning, traditional Filipino fare that was nothing like the bland British food I'd grown up with, but somehow perfect for my newly awakened appetite. Fresh rice, dried fish, vegetables I couldn't pronounce but devoured anyway. "Is it too spicy, honey?" she'd ask, watching me eat with the concern of a woman who genuinely cared about my comfort. She called me honey, not sir or kuya like the other girls at the bar. Just honey, spoken with an accent that made my heart skip beats I thought it had forgotten how to skip. I enrolled Mia in the best private school in Tagum, bought her uniforms and books and a backpack shaped like a unicorn that made her squeal with delight. "My papa is very kind," she told her new classmates, and hearing her call me Papa for the first time nearly broke me in the best possible way. Jessamine worked hard to prove she deserved this new life, cleaning the house until it sparkled, learning to use the washing machine and dishwasher like they were sacred artifacts. "I want to be worthy of your kindness," she told me one evening as we watched a Filipino soap opera together on the couch. "I want to be the woman you see when you look at me." She curled up against my side during the dramatic parts, translating the rapid-fire Tagalog and laughing at my confused expressions when the plot took yet another impossible turn. On Sundays, she'd take me to meet her extended family, introducing me to cousins and aunts and neighbors who all said the same thing: "You're a blessing to Jessamine, sir. She's never been treated with respect before. You can see it in her face, how happy she is now." I felt useful again for the first time in years, needed in a way that had nothing to do with pity or obligation. When Jessamine would fall asleep watching television, her head on my shoulder and her breathing soft and steady, I'd stroke her hair and whisper thank you to whatever force had brought this unlikely family into my lonely life. But happiness, I've learned through bitter experience, is like tropical weather in the Philippines, beautiful and intense while it lasts, but storms can appear without warning and destroy everything you thought was solid. The first crack in my paradise appeared during month 4, small enough that I convinced myself it was nothing worth worrying about. Jessamine's phone started living face down on every surface, always on silent, buzzing with mysterious messages she'd take to the bathroom to answer in whispered conversations I couldn't quite hear. "Who was that, love?" I'd ask when she returned, forcing my voice to sound casual rather than suspicious. "Just my cousin Rika," she'd say, but her eyes would dart away from mine like they were searching for escape routes. "She worries about me living with a foreigner. Very traditional family, you understand." The bathroom conversations became more frequent, lasting longer, happening at odd hours when she thought I was sleeping. I'd lie in bed listening to the muffled sound of her voice through the thin walls, speaking rapid Bisaya that I couldn't understand, but that sounded urgent, almost frantic. When I asked about it the next morning, she'd look confused. "What conversation?" "I was just taking a shower, honey." "Maybe you heard the neighbors." But I knew the difference between shower sounds and whispered phone calls, the same way I'd known when Margaret was hiding her pain during those final months. Then came the trips to visit her sick aunt in the mountains of Bukidnon. "She's getting worse," Jessamine explained, packing an overnight bag with clothes I'd never seen before. "The family thinks this might be her last few weeks. I need to help take care of her." It sounded reasonable, even admirable. What kind of man would deny a woman the chance to care for dying family? "Of course you should go," I said, pressing 10,000 pesos into her hand for medicine and expenses. "Stay as long as you need to." She kissed my cheek and whispered, "You're the kindest man in the world, Angus. I'm so lucky to have you." But when she returned 3 days later, she was wearing jewelry I'd never seen, carrying shopping bags from expensive stores in Cagayan de Oro, and her phone was buzzing more frantically than ever. "The aunt gave me these," she explained, fingering the gold earrings that had certainly cost more than most Filipino families see in a year. "She wanted me to look nice for you, to represent the family well." It was a believable story, the kind of generous gesture that fit my understanding of Filipino family culture. But the earrings looked new, still in their original packaging when I glimpsed them in her bag. And the clothes she'd returned with were designer brands that seemed unlikely gifts from a dying woman in a rural mountain village. The questioning looks I gave her must have been more obvious than I intended, because Jessamine's responses became increasingly emotional. "You don't trust me?" she'd ask, tears welling up in her eyes whenever I expressed even mild curiosity about her activities. "After everything I've given up for you? After all the ways I've changed my life?" The guilt would hit me like a physical blow. Here was a woman who'd left sex work to build a clean life with me, and I was repaying her sacrifice with suspicion and jealousy. "I'm sorry, lass," I'd say, pulling her close and hating myself for doubting her. "I just worry about you when you're gone." "I miss you," she'd cry into my shoulder and whisper. "My past still follows me sometimes. People judge me for what I used to do." I need you to be patient while I figure out how to live normally. So I was patient. Patient as the trips became longer and more frequent. Patient as Mia moved in with cousin Rika, temporarily, because the mountain air was bad for her asthma. Patient as Jessamine's explanations became more elaborate and less convincing. Patient as the woman I'd fallen in love with transformed into someone I barely recognized, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. Her laughter became forced, her affection mechanical, her eyes constantly checking her phone even during our most intimate moments. The morning I discovered Jessamine had blocked me on Facebook marked the beginning of the end, though I was still too deep in denial to recognize it. "Why can't I see your profile anymore?" I asked over breakfast, trying to keep my voice light and conversational. She barely looked up from her rice and dried fish, the meal she'd made every morning for 6 months but now seemed to approach like a chore. "I'm cleaning up my past," she said, her voice flat and rehearsed. "There are pictures I don't want you to see, bad memories from the bar days. It's better this way." It sounded reasonable, even considerate, a woman protecting her new life from the shadows of her old one. But reasonable explanations were starting to feel like band-aids on bullet wounds, temporary, fixes for problems that kept getting bigger. That evening, while Jessamine showered, I checked her dresser drawer where she kept her personal items. The red dress from Blue Moon, the one she'd worn the night we met, was gone. So were several other outfits I remembered from her dancing days, replaced by clothes I'd never seen her wear around the house. "Where's your dress from Blue Moon?" I asked when she emerged from the bathroom, a towel wrapped around her hair like a turban. She froze for just a moment, her reflection caught in the mirror with an expression I couldn't read. Then she smiled, but it was the wrong kind of smile, too bright and too quick. "I threw it away, honey. Spring cleaning. Why would I keep those old things?" But her eyes were doing that thing again, looking everywhere except at me, and I knew with horrible certainty that she was lying. The next morning, she left for another aunt visit, this time to Zamboanga, where a different relative was supposedly having surgery. I sent her 15,000 pesos for hospital expenses and told myself this was just temporary stress, that families in crisis required flexibility and understanding. At Robinson's Mall that afternoon, buying groceries for the increasingly empty house, I ran into Klaus, a German expat I'd met at a coffee shop weeks earlier. He approached me with the kind of hesitant expression people wear when they're about to deliver bad news. "Angus, right?" he said, checking his phone like he was consulting notes. "I thought that was you. Listen, isn't that your girl?" He showed me a photo on his Facebook feed, a group shot from some expat gathering I hadn't attended. There, in the background but clearly visible, was Jessamine in a dress I'd never seen, laughing with a group of foreign men at what looked like a bar or restaurant. "She used to work at Diamonds, didn't she?" Klaus continued, oblivious to the fact that his words were slowly destroying my world. "Nice girl. Very professional. I heard she retired, though. Good for her. Diamonds. The most expensive gentlemen's club in Davao, where foreign men went to spend serious money on serious fantasies. The kind of place that made Blue Moon look like a church social. You must be mistaken," I managed to say, but my voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. Klaus shrugged and walked away, leaving me standing in the produce section of a Filipino mall, holding a bag of overpriced apples and finally understanding that the woman I'd thought I'd saved had never actually needed saving at all. The photos that completely destroyed my carefully constructed reality arrived on a Tuesday morning via Facebook Messenger, delivered by Mark, an Australian expat I'd befriended during my early weeks in Davao. His message was simple and devastating. "Mate, I'm really sorry to be the one to show you this, but isn't this your girl?" My hands shook as I opened the attachment, my coffee growing cold on the kitchen table while my world collapsed one pixel at a time. There was Jessamine, radiant in a silver sequin dress I'd never seen, dancing on the familiar stage of Blue Moon with an energy and joy I hadn't witnessed in months. But these weren't old photos from her past life. The timestamp showed they'd been taken 3 nights ago, while she was supposedly caring for her dying aunt in Zamboanga. In one image, She was laughing with a bottle of Red Horse beer raised high, her arm around a young German tourist who looked exactly like I probably had 8 months earlier. Hopeful, grateful, probably sending money to his new girlfriend's sick relatives and feeling like a hero for it. I scrolled through the entire album with the fascination of a man watching his own execution. There were dozens of photos spanning several weeks, showing Jessamine not just back at Blue Moon but thriving there. New outfits, new jewelry, new customers to charm, with the same sad story that had originally captured my heart. In some pictures, she was with the German. In others, a middle-aged Australian who looked wealthy enough to afford the fantasy. And in one particularly devastating shot, she was posing with 3 different foreign men, all of them looking at her with the same adoring expression I'd worn for months. She looked happy, genuinely happy, in a way I hadn't seen since those first weeks in my house. This wasn't the desperate, grateful woman I thought I'd rescued from a life of exploitation. This was someone in her element, doing what she'd always done, with or without my salvation narrative to complicate things. The saddest part wasn't that she'd lied to me. The saddest part was realizing that the version of Jessamine I'd fallen in love with had been a performance, and not even her best one. I called her immediately, my fingers fumbling with the phone number I'd memorized months ago, straight to voicemail, her sweet voice asking callers to leave a message in English or Bisaya. I tried again. Same result. I sent a text message. "We need to talk. Now." 3 blue check marks appeared, indicating she'd read it, but no reply came. I tried calling again, and this time the call wouldn't go through at all. She'd blocked my number. Then I checked Facebook, Instagram, Viber, every platform where we'd maintained contact. Blocked on all of them. In the span of 30 minutes, I'd gone from having a girlfriend to being a complete stranger to the woman who'd shared my bed and called me honey for half a year. I spent the rest of that week in a kind of emotional purgatory, sitting in my too big house surrounded by reminders of a life that had apparently never existed. Jessamine's coffee cup still sat in the kitchen sink. Her shampoo still crowded my shower shelf, and Mia's toys were scattered around the living room like evidence of happier times. I kept checking my phone compulsively, hoping for some explanation that would make sense of everything, some message that would restore the narrative I'd believed in so completely. But the silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the distant noise of Filipino life continuing outside my windows. Neighbors laughing, children playing, tricycles puttering past with their characteristic engine noise. The world kept spinning as if my heart hadn't just been systematically dismantled by a 29-year-old woman who'd played her role so perfectly I'd never once questioned the script. A week after the photos arrived, I did something I probably should have done months earlier. I went back to Blue Moon, not to confront Jessamine but simply to see the truth with my own eyes, to witness the reality I'd been so carefully shielded from. The bar looked exactly the same as it had 8 months earlier. Blue neon lights casting everything in an underwater glow, the smell of cigarettes and cheap cologne thick enough to choke on. I ordered a San Miguel and found the same dark corner where I'd first watched Jessamine dance. Back when I'd thought I was just a tourist observing local culture rather than a customer being sized up for a long-term con. The music started, and there she was, Jessamine in her element, moving to the beat with the kind of natural grace that had originally caught my attention. But now I could see what I'd been too love-struck to notice before. This wasn't someone going through the motions of a job she hated. This was an artist practicing her craft, a professional who was genuinely good at what she did. She commanded the stage with confidence, flirted with customers with just the right balance of availability and distance, and managed the entire room's attention like a conductor directing an orchestra. During her break, she sat with the German from the photos, listening to him talk with the same rapt attention she'd once given my stories about Scotland. He was probably telling her about his pension, his lonely life back in Munich, his dreams of finding someone to share his golden years with. The same fairy tale I'd sold myself, delivered by a different narrator but featuring the same desperate protagonist and the same knowing co-star. She didn't see me that night, thank God, because I couldn't have handled the conversation that would have followed. What would I have said? Why did you lie to me? as if the answer wasn't obvious. Did you ever care about me at all? As if that question had any answer that would make me feel better. Instead, I sat in my corner nursing my beer, watching the woman I'd thought I knew perform for strangers, and felt myself aging 10 years in the span of an hour. When a young British man started talking to her during her next break, hanging on her every word with the same desperate attention I'd shown months earlier, I finished my drink and walked out into the humid Davao night. I found myself at a 7-Eleven, one of those bright, air-conditioned sanctuaries that dot every corner of the Philippines, and sat there until sunrise, drinking instant coffee and trying to figure out how a man who'd lived 74 years could be so completely wrong about everything he thought he'd learned. That night in the convenience store, surrounded by fluorescent lights and the soft hum of refrigeration units, I wrote Jessamine a message I never sent. I typed it out on my phone, deleted it, typed it again, my arthritic fingers struggling with the small keys and the weight of everything I wanted to say. I forgive you, I wrote. I'm not angry, just disappointed. I thought we were building something real together, something that would last longer than your next trip to visit a sick relative. I know you're surviving the only way you know how, and I don't blame you for that. This world isn't kind to women like you, and men like me make it easy to take advantage of loneliness disguised as love. I continued typing, the words flowing like a confession I'd been holding inside for weeks. I blame myself for thinking I could be your fairy tale ending when maybe I was just another customer with a bigger wallet and a longer lease on hope. I should have known that 29-year-old women don't fall in love with 74-year-old men unless there's something in it for them besides conversation and companionship. I should have listened when people tried to warn me, but I was so hungry for purpose that I mistook a business transaction for a love story. The message grew longer as I sat there, becoming less about Jessamine and more about my own failures. I hope you find peace someday, lass. I hope Mia grows up strong and smart and has more choices than you did. I hope she never has to smile at men she doesn't love or pretend gratitude for kindness that comes with invisible price tags. I hope you remember that for a few months, an old Scottish fool loved you completely and sincerely, even if you couldn't love him back the same way. Maybe that's worth something, even if it wasn't worth staying for. I read that message 17 times, editing and re-editing, until it said exactly what I wanted to say in exactly the right tone. Then I deleted every word. Some truths are too heavy for text messages. Some goodbyes are better left unsaid. Some relationships end not with dramatic confrontations, but with quiet acceptance that the story you thought you were living was actually someone else's performance, and your role was never as important as you believed. I spent the following days packing Jessamine's belongings into cardboard boxes, sorting through the debris of what I'd thought was a shared life. Her favorite coffee cup, the one with a cartoon cat that she'd claimed reminded her of her childhood pet, the romance novels she'd read in bed, their pages marked with receipts and bobby pins. A note she'd left me once that said, "Thank you for making me feel beautiful today," in her careful handwriting. I kept that note, not because I still believed it was sincere, but because for one moment, writing those words, maybe she had felt something real. The hardest items to pack were Mia's things. The unicorn backpack I'd bought for her first day at the new school. The educational tablet loaded with games and stories she'd never finished. The stuffed elephant she'd left behind when she moved in with cousin Rika, probably forgotten in the rush to distance herself from the foreign man who'd briefly played father in her young life. I found myself wondering if she missed our Sunday morning pancakes or the way I'd help her with English homework at the kitchen table. Probably not. Children are resilient in ways adults can only envy, and she likely had new routines, new stability, new father figures who wouldn't disappear when the money ran out. 2 weeks after the photos destroyed my world, I made a decision that surprised even me. I booked a flight back to Aberdeen without telling anyone, not Mark or Klaus or any of the other expats who'd probably want to offer advice or sympathy or cautionary tales about their own romantic disasters. I just wanted to go home and figure out how to live with being a fool, how to rebuild some kind of dignity from the ashes of my tropical delusion. The process of leaving was harder than arriving had been. Arriving in the Philippines, I'd been running towards something, chasing hope and possibility and the promise of mattering again. Leaving, I was running from the evidence of my own stupidity, carrying the weight of expensive lessons and cheaper pride. I settled my accounts, closed my utility services, and gave away most of the furniture I'd bought during those optimistic early months when I'd thought I was building a permanent life. My landlord Tony seemed genuinely sad to see me go. "What happened, sir?" he asked while inspecting the house for damage. "Your girlfriend, she was nice, quiet, respectful. I thought you were happy here." I could have told him the truth, could have shared the entire sordid story as a warning to the next lonely foreigner who'd inevitably rent this same house with the same dreams. Instead, I just said, "Things change, Tony. Sometimes home calls you back." He nodded with the wisdom of someone who'd probably seen this story play out before, and we shook hands like gentlemen who understood that some explanations aren't worth the breath they'd require. At Ninoy Aquino Airport, waiting for my boarding call in the same terminal where I'd arrived with such hope 8 months earlier, I watched the familiar dance of international departures. Expats leaving and arriving, some looking excited and optimistic, others wearing the shell-shocked expression of people fleeing their own bad decisions. Near my gate, I spotted an elderly American man walking with a young Filipina who looked barely older than my own granddaughter. She was beautiful, attentive, calling him Daddy in that sweet voice I knew so well. He looked exactly like I had months earlier, drunk on the possibility of being needed again, convinced that this time would be different. I wanted to approach him, to share what I'd learned about the difference between being loved and being useful, about the cost of confusing gratitude with affection, but I didn't. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way, through personal experience and private heartbreak. Some men need to break their own hearts to understand what hearts are actually for, and interfering with that process is just another form of the arrogance that had gotten me into trouble in the first place. I boarded my flight carrying one photo of Jessamine and me from that perfect day in Siargao, the day she promised me forever while the sunset painted everything golden. I kept it not because I still believed her promises, but because I wanted to remember how it felt to hope again, even if that hope was built on quicksand and sustained by willful blindness. For a few months, I'd felt young again, useful again, loved again. The fact that it was mostly an illusion didn't make those feelings less real at the time. Now I'm back in Aberdeen, living in the same house where Margaret and I grew old together, where I'd thought my story had ended before I decided to write a new chapter in a foreign country. My sons call more often since my return, worried about their father who flew halfway around the world to chase a dream that turned into a cautionary tale. "What happened, Dad?" David asked during our first conversation after my return. "You sounded so happy in your emails. Was it the heat? The food? Did someone hurt you?" I could hear the genuine concern in his voice, the same tone he'd used when asking about Margaret's condition during those final months. How do you explain to your adult children that their father was seduced by kindness, manipulated by tears, and ultimately abandoned by someone young enough to be their sister? "I just missed home," I told him, which was true enough to avoid deeper conversation. "The Philippines is beautiful, but it's not Scotland. Sometimes a man needs to come back to where he belongs." David accepted this explanation because it fit the narrative of a homesick retiree rather than a heartbroken fool, and I was grateful for his willingness not to dig deeper. Robert and James had similar conversations with me, offering help I didn't need and concern I probably didn't deserve. They were good sons, better than I'd been as a father during those grief-stricken years after Margaret's death. The house felt different upon my return, smaller somehow, as if my time in the tropics had expanded my sense of space and possibility before contracting it again into Scottish reality. Margaret's presence was still everywhere, in the photographs lining the mantelpiece and the careful way she'd arranged furniture that I'd never had the heart to change. But now her memory felt less like a weight and more like a gentle reminder of what real love looked like. She'd loved me for 47 years without asking for anything except my presence, my fidelity, and my promise to live after she was gone. Jessamine had loved my wallet for 8 months while asking for everything I was willing to give and more besides. The contrast was illuminating in ways I hadn't expected. Margaret's love had been steady, reliable, built on shared experiences and mutual respect earned over decades of marriage. Even during our worst arguments, and we'd had plenty, there was never any question about our commitment to each other, never any doubt that we were building something together that would last. Jessamine's love had been intense but fragile, dependent on my continued usefulness and willingness to ignore obvious red flags. The moment I'd stopped being profitable, I'd stopped existing in her world entirely. I spent my first month back in Aberdeen processing these revelations, walking the same streets Margaret and I had walked during our courtship, sitting in the same pubs where we'd celebrated anniversaries and mourned losses. The city had changed during my absence, new construction mixing with ancient stone, young couples holding hands where Margaret and I once had. Life had continued without me, just as it had continued in the Philippines after my departure. The world, I realized, was remarkably good at moving forward regardless of individual heartbreak. But I'd learned something important during those months of tropical delusion, something that made the expensive lesson almost worthwhile. I hadn't gone to the Philippines to find love. I'd gone there to find myself, to feel like I mattered again, to escape the echo chamber of my own loneliness. Jessamine had given me exactly what I was looking for exactly as long as I was willing to pay for it. That didn't make her evil or me a victim. It just made us both human beings trying to survive our own particular kinds of pain in the best ways we knew how. She'd needed money, security, and the illusion of a better future for herself and her daughter. I'd needed to feel useful, wanted, and capable of inspiring love in someone young and beautiful. For a while, that arrangement had felt like love to both of us. Maybe it even was love, in its own complicated, transactional way. The fact that it couldn't last didn't invalidate the moments when it felt real, when her laughter seemed genuine and her gratitude appeared sincere. I don't regret loving Jessamine. I regret not loving myself enough to recognize the difference between being wanted and being used, between inspiring genuine affection and simply meeting someone's immediate needs. I regret ignoring the advice of people who tried to warn me, dismissing their concerns as jealousy or cultural misunderstanding. Most of all, I regret the months I spent in denial, making excuses for behavior that should have been obviously suspicious to anyone not blinded by loneliness and late-life desperation. But those regrets come with a strange kind of peace. For the first time since Margaret's death, I feel like I understand myself again. I know what I'm looking for in human connection, and more importantly, I know what I'm not looking for. I'm not looking to be anyone's savior or meal ticket or passport to a better life. I'm not looking to recapture my youth through someone else's borrowed affection. I'm just looking to matter to someone who matters to me, for reasons that have nothing to do with bank account balances or visa applications. The Philippines taught me that love at 74 is possible, but it also taught me that desperation makes poor foundation for lasting relationships. Real love, the kind Margaret and I shared, is built on equality, mutual respect, and shared investment in a common future. What Jessamine and I had was built on need, inequality, and fundamentally different expectations about what we owed each other. Some evenings now, when the Scottish rain patters against my windows and the house feels too quiet, I think about Jessamine, not with anger or bitterness, but with something approaching, understanding. She's probably back at Blue Moon right now, dancing for new customers who believe they're different from all the others, who think their kindness and generosity make them special. Maybe one of them will offer her what I offered, and maybe she'll accept again, playing the same role with slightly different dialogue. I hope she's well. I hope Mia is thriving in school and still dreams of becoming a teacher. I hope Jessamine finds whatever she's really looking for, whether that's financial security, genuine love, or simply the freedom to stop performing for men like me who mistake loneliness for wisdom and generosity for love. She's braver than I gave her credit for, surviving in a world that offers women like her limited choices and then judges them for the choices they make. As for me, I'm learning to be alone without being lonely, to find purpose in small things rather than grand gestures. I volunteer at a local charity now, helping elderly people navigate computer technology and government paperwork. It's satisfying work that doesn't require me to travel thousands of miles or risk my heart in the process. I've reconnected with old friends, men my own age who understand what it means to outlive your original dreams and find new ones. Margaret's photograph sits on my nightstand now, and sometimes I talk to her before sleep, telling her about my day and asking for her advice on matters both trivial and important. You were right. I told her picture last night. I did need to live after you were gone. I just needed to learn how to do it honestly. I think she would have forgiven my tropical adventure, maybe even understood it. She always said I had too big a heart for my own good, that my desire to help people would eventually get me into trouble. She was right about that too. The photo of Jessamine and me from Siargao sits in my desk drawer now, not hidden but not displayed either. Sometimes I look at it and remember how it felt to believe in forever. Again, even if that forever lasted only as long as a sunset over the Philippine Sea. The man in that photo looks happy, genuinely happy, in a way I hadn't seen in my mirror for years. That happiness was based on an illusion, but it was still happiness. And maybe that's enough. Some stories don't have neat endings, clean resolutions, or satisfying moral lessons. Some stories are just about people trying to get through their days with as much dignity and as little pain as possible, making mistakes and learning from them, hurting others and being hurt in return. My story with Jessamine is one of those stories. It changed me, cost me more than I could afford, and taught me things I probably should have learned decades earlier. But it also reminded me that I'm still capable of love, still capable of hope, still capable of believing in the possibility of connection even when experience suggests otherwise. Those capabilities come with risks, obviously, but they also come with the potential for genuine joy. The trick, I've learned, is knowing the difference between reasonable risk and willful blindness, between optimism and delusion. I'm 74 years old now, not 73. The months in the Philippines aged me in ways that had nothing to do with tropical heat and everything to do with emotional wear. But they also taught me that my story isn't over yet, that there are still chapters to be written, still connections to be made, still purposes to be discovered. I just need to write those chapters with my eyes open, my heart guarded but not closed, and my expectations grounded in reality rather than fantasy. The next time someone promises me forever, I'll listen more carefully to what they're really saying. The next time I feel like someone's savior, I'll ask myself what I'm really trying to save. And the next time I fall in love, if there is a next time, I'll make sure it's with someone who loves me back for reasons that have nothing to do with what I can provide, and everything to do with who I am when I'm not trying to be anyone's hero. That might be the most important lesson Jessamine taught me, worth every peso I spent and every tear I shed learning it. Love should be about addition, not subtraction, about two people bringing out the best in each other rather than one person filling the void in another's life. Margaret and I had that kind of love. Jessamine and I had something else entirely, something that felt like love but was really just need dressed up in romantic language and tropical sunsets. I'm grateful for both experiences now. Grateful for Margaret's decades of authentic love, and grateful for Jessamine's months of beautiful deception. Both taught me things I needed to know about myself, about relationships, about the difference between what I want and what I actually need. Both left their mark on my heart, Margaret's in the form of lasting joy despite the pain of loss, Jessamine's in the form of hard-won wisdom despite the sting of betrayal. And maybe that's what growing old is really about. Collecting these experiences and lessons until you finally understand not just how to love others, but how to love yourself enough to demand the real thing rather than settling for convincing imitations. I'm still learning that lesson. Probably will be until the day I die. But at least now I know what I'm learning and why it matters. The rain has stopped outside my window, and Aberdeen is settling into another quiet evening. Somewhere in the Philippines, the sun is rising over cities and islands where other lonely men are probably making the same mistakes I made, falling for the same promises I believed. I can't save them any more than I could save Jessamine. We all have to find our own way through the maze of human connection, making our own errors and discovering our own truths. But if any of them ever ask, I'll tell them what I've learned, that love is possible at any age, but but it requires honesty from all parties involved. That kindness and generosity are admirable qualities, but they don't entitle you to love in return. That being needed isn't the same as being loved, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them find their own way rather than trying to rescue them from lives you don't fully understand. Most importantly, I'll tell them that coming home doesn't always mean going back to where you started. Sometimes it means finally understanding where you belong, not geographically but emotionally, and making peace with the person you've become through all your mistakes and misadventures. I'm home now, not just in Aberdeen but in my own skin, carrying my scars and my stories with something approaching grace. And that, I think, is worth more than all the tropical sunsets and whispered promises in the world. That's the kind of wealth that can't be stolen, can't be faked, and can't be lost to anyone else's agenda. It's the kind of love that starts with yourself and radiates outward, attracting the right kind of people for the right kind of reasons. That's the love I'm looking for now. And this time, I'll know it when I see it. The hardest part about coming home wasn't explaining my absence to family and friends. It wasn't dealing with the financial losses or the wounded pride. The hardest part was learning to live with the silence again, the same silence that had driven me to the Philippines in the first place. But this silence felt different now. It wasn't the desperate, clawing emptiness of grief that had consumed me after Margaret's death. This was the quiet of a man who'd finally stopped running from himself. I've started keeping a journal, something I never did during my marriage or in those dark years after losing Margaret. Writing helps me process what happened, helps me understand the difference between the story I lived and the story I told myself I was living. Today I realized, I wrote last week, that I went to the Philippines not to find love, but to find proof that I was still worthy of being loved. Jessamine gave me that proof for a price I was willing to pay until the bill came due. My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a widow herself, has become an unexpected friend. She brings me soup when the Scottish winter feels particularly brutal, and I help her with her garden when spring finally arrives. "You look different," she told me one afternoon while we planted bulbs that wouldn't bloom until next year. "Sadder, maybe, but also clearer, like you've stopped pretending about something." I didn't ask what she meant, but I knew she was right. I have stopped pretending about a lot of things. The expat YouTube channels that originally inspired my Philippine adventure still appear in my feed sometimes, and I watch them with different eyes now. The same promises, the same smiling couples, the same narrative of Western men finding paradise and love in Southeast Asia. I see the comments from lonely men planning their own escapes, and I want to warn them, but I don't. Everyone deserves the right to make their own mistakes, to learn their own lessons, to discover their own truths about love and loneliness and the price of both. Last month, I received a friend request on Facebook from a profile I didn't recognize. The photo showed a young Filipina with a child who looked remarkably like Mia. No message, just the request. I stared at it for an hour before declining. Some doors, once closed, should stay that way. Some chapters, once ended, don't need epilogues. Jessamine is living her life, whatever that looks like now, and I'm living mine. That's as it should be. I've been thinking about Margaret more lately, not with the crushing weight of loss that used to accompany her memory, but with gratitude for the 47 years we shared. Real years, honest years, built on a foundation that couldn't be shaken by financial hardship or illness or the simple passage of time. I kept my promise. I told her photograph last night. I lived. I made mistakes, expensive ones, but I lived. And I learned the difference between existing and living, between being needed and being loved. The Scottish spring is coming early this year, and I can see green shoots pushing through the soil in my back garden. Margaret planted those bulbs 20 years ago, and they still return every spring, faithful as sunrise. That's what real love looks like, I think. Not the tropical intensity of passion that burns bright and fast, but the quiet persistence of commitment that survives seasons and storms and the simple passage of time. My son James visited last weekend, bringing his teenage daughter Sarah with him. She's 15 now, smart and funny, and completely unimpressed by her grandfather's international adventure. "So you went to the Philippines and got your heart broken by a gold digger?" she said with the brutal honesty that only teenagers can deliver. "That's like super predictable, Grandpa." Then she hugged me and said, "But I'm glad you're home. Mom was worried you'd never come back." Out of the mouths of babes, as they say. I've started volunteering again, this time at a center for elderly immigrants who struggle with English and bureaucracy. Many of them are Filipino women who came to Scotland decades ago, working as nurses and caregivers, building lives far from home through determination and sacrifice. Their stories remind me that immigration and displacement take many forms, that survival sometimes requires compromises that outsiders can't understand. I help them with paperwork and listen to their stories, and sometimes I think about Jessamine, wondering if she ever made it to nursing school, if she ever found the legitimate future she claimed to want. The truth is, I'll probably never know what parts of her story were real and what parts were performance. Maybe she really did want to be a nurse. Maybe she really did hate working at the bar. Maybe, for a few weeks at least, she really did feel safe with me. Or maybe the entire narrative was carefully constructed theater, designed to extract maximum emotional and financial investment from a lonely old man who needed to feel useful again. It doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I survived the experience with my capacity for love intact, even if my capacity for naive trust has been permanently damaged. Dr. McLeod, my physician, says I'm in better health now than when I left for the Philippines nearly a year ago. "Whatever happened over there," he said during my recent checkup, "it seems to have given you some kind of purpose. Your blood pressure is down, you've lost weight, and you seem more engaged with life." I didn't tell him that heartbreak, properly processed, can be as therapeutic as any medicine. Sometimes you have to break completely before you can heal properly. I'm planning a trip this summer, not to Southeast Asia, but to Ireland, where Margaret and I honeymooned 50 years ago. I want to see the cliffs of Moher again, to walk the roads we walked when we were young and everything seemed possible. This time, I'll be traveling alone, but not lonely. There's a difference I'm finally old enough to understand. The photo of Jessamine and me from Siargao sits in my desk drawer now, not hidden but not displayed either. Sometimes I look at it and remember how it felt to believe in forever again, even if that forever lasted only as long as a sunset over the Philippine Sea. The man in that photo looks happy, genuinely happy, in a way I hadn't seen in my mirror for years. That happiness was based on an illusion, but it was still happiness, and maybe that's enough. Maybe the capacity to feel joy, even temporarily, even under false pretenses, is worth something after all. Some nights, when the Scottish wind howls around my house and the past feels particularly heavy, I imagine what I might say to other men my age who are contemplating their own international romantic adventures. I'd tell them that love is possible at any age, but it requires honesty from all parties involved. I'd tell them that kindness and generosity don't entitle anyone to love in return, and that being needed isn't the same as being loved. I'd tell them that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them find their own way, rather than trying to rescue them from lives you don't fully understand. Most importantly, I'd tell them that coming home doesn't always mean going back to where you started. Sometimes it means finally understanding where you belong, not geographically but emotionally, and making peace with the person you've become through all your mistakes and misadventures. I'm home now, not just in Aberdeen but in my own skin, carrying my scars and my stories with something approaching grace. And that understanding, that peace, is worth more than all the tropical sunsets and whispered promises in the world. It's the kind of wealth that can't be stolen, can't be faked, and can't be lost to anyone else's agenda. It's the kind of love that starts with yourself and radiates outward, attracting the right kind of people for the right kind of reasons. That's the love I'm looking for now, and this time, I'll recognize it when I see it because I finally know what I'm looking at when I look in the mirror. I see a man who loved completely, failed spectacularly, learned painfully, and survived with dignity and tact. And maybe, just maybe, That's enough for whatever chapters remain to be written in this long, strange, beautiful story we call life.